As you're joining us, we're just waiting a few more minutes for the room to fully open, but thank you for being here. We'll get started very shortly. Good morning, everyone. We'll just take a few more minutes to let others join the room. We'll get started with the program in just a moment. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Russell Weaver. I'm going to pass things off to my colleague, Kriki Kazak, for just a moment to go over some logistics, and then we'll begin with the program very shortly here.
Great, thank you, Rusty. Nyawe Skeno, Kriki Kazak, Onondawagat Nia. I wanted to welcome you all today. I'm the Collaboration and Research Specialist and the High Road Fellow Program Coordinator here at the Cornell ILR Buffalo CoLab. I'm going to start us off with the territorial acknowledgement and then jump through some of the logistics for today's sessions. In keeping with regional protocol, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and by honoring the sovereignty of the 6 nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where we are situated and where the majority of our work takes place. In this acknowledgement, we hope to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and remorse for the harm and mistakes of the far and recent past. And we pledge to work towards partnership in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. Just to talk through some of the logistics, hopefully by this point, folks are pretty familiar with Zoom. So this will just be a little bit of an overview. So first, I just wanted to encourage you all to be asking questions throughout the day. If you toggle towards the bottom of your window, you'll see a Q&A button. We highly encourage you all to ask questions of our moderator and of our really great speakers that we have today. Another thing that we wanted to acknowledge is that some folks aren't able to join us live, so we will be recording this session. It'll be available through the Buffalo CoLab YouTube and on the Cornell ILR homepage. Just a few other things. If you'd like to enable closed captioning, if you toggle towards the bottom as well, you're able to show subtitles and that will display what it is that our speakers are saying. Finally, just as a reminder, you all have received 3 separate links to our 3 separate sessions today, including this welcome session. At the end of this session, we'll post a link in the chat to the next session. So just wanted to remind you at the beginning that we'll make that available. I'll pass it back to Rusty for our welcome.
Thank you, Kriki, and thank you everyone for joining us. So I am going to share just a few images here as I give you some context for the event today and what we'll be doing here. So good morning again, and welcome to the Cornell University ILR Buffalo CoLab's first annual High Road Policy Summit. My name is Russell Weaver, and I'm the Director of Research at the ILR Schools Buffalo CoLab. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-sponsors for today's event: the ILR Schools Worker Institute, the Western New York Area Labor Federation, the Partnership for the Public Good, and Cooperation Buffalo. We'll be linking to each of these organizations in the chat so that you can check out the amazing work that they do to make public policy and the economy work for all New Yorkers, particularly in Buffalo, Niagara, where my unit is based. That unit, the Buffalo CoLab, has been working to advance an equitable economy and democratic community in Western New York continuously for the last 75 years. Under the visionary leadership of Lugene Flaron and more recently, Kathy Creighton, we carry out that mission through engaged student learning opportunities, public education and training, democratizing data and other actionable information about our region, and engaging in applied research and policy development. In all of these spaces, we strive to situate our work within a consistent unifying frame, that of a high road economy that works for everyone. So what is a high road economy? To start, we can contrast it with some things that we know to be true about our current economy. It's no secret that our existing political and economic systems aren't really built to create equal outcomes for all people and places. In the US, Black families are twice as likely as white families to have zero wealth. Women earn 82 cents for every dollar earned by men, a gap that isn't on track to close until at least the year 2059. Compared to white men, Black and indigenous women and Latina women are 3.5 to 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty. And prior to COVID-19, just under half of Black workers and only about 2 in 5 Latinx workers had employer-sponsored health insurance, compared to 2/3 of white workers. Taken together, these statistics, which barely even scratch the surface of the levels of inequality in society, are evidence of policy failures. That factors like race, ethnicity, and gender have as much power as they do to predict whether someone earns poverty wages, works in a job without health benefits, pays too much for low quality housing, has a chronic health issue, you name it, right? The fact that individual characteristics can be systematically linked to these and other poor life outcomes means that we haven't really carried out our nation's mission to build a society in which all people are created and treated equally. Rather, our society and economic system tends to put profits ahead of people and the planet. We give away public dollars to firms who pay sub-living wages in the name of development, even as the firm's workers might struggle to survive and its practices might pollute surrounding communities. That's just one example, one that you're likely to hear more about in our second session today, but it's a representative example of why we're here. When we as a society, through the policies that we adopt and the institutions we create, prioritize profits and economic growth over people and communities, we're taking the low road. We're putting self-interest ahead of the common good. If we're serious about wanting to address persistent forms of inequality and the injustices that emanate from them, then we need new policies and institutions to replace the ones responsible for creating the problems. In short, we need policies and institutions that can build a high road. That term, the high road, was coined for use with respect to economic developments by a social scientist named Joel Rogers back in the 1990s. To Rogers and his colleagues, a high road society is one that's constantly progressing toward shared prosperity, environmental sustainability and ecological integrity, and participatory democracy. We're not here today to debate these three ends. That's not to say that they're perfect articulations of what a society should look like, but they give us a serviceable starting point for thinking about what we might aim for as we design new policies and institutions that explicitly attack our systemic problems. From that perspective, shared prosperity, environmental sustainability, and participatory democracy are arguably as fitting ends for today as they were back in the 90s. What we want to be clearer about today, where today I mean both the summits and the present political moments, are the means for achieving these ends or ends like them. For decades, we've watched as well-intentioned policies pass in one year, only for the same underlying problems to strike again, frequently in some mutated, more extreme form down the road. One reason for the recurrent nature of these problems is that most of the means we use to pursue better ends aren't calibrated toward those ends. They're reforms or patches on a low-road system that's built to produce low-road outcomes. To break free from that cycle, we need high-road policies and institutions that directly engage with, dismantle, and replace the inequitable structures of our low-road system. Such policies and institutions will be actively anti-racist, reparative of past and present systemic harms, designed to bridge divides and build solidarity, and above all, innovative. That we might have the same social goals today as we did in the 90s, and for decades, if not centuries before, suggests that by living inside the box in our policy thinking, we've been depriving ourselves of the oxygen we need to re-energize our bodies and live well with one another. The goal of high road policy is to punch holes into that box, to get a glimpse of the possibilities that lie beyond it, and to take in much needed oxygen in the here and now. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming stakeholders from government, community-based organizations, labor, academia, and the private sector to explore concrete high road policies and practices for right here, right now. We will hear from 3 panels of experts who engage in conversations about racial equity in policymaking and at work, economic development subsidies, and worker ownership and control of workplaces. But before jumping in, it's now my pleasure to introduce Kathy Creighton, Director of Cornell in Buffalo. Thank you very much.
I had trouble unmuting myself there. Sorry. Thank you, Rusty. It's my pleasure to introduce our dean, who's joined us this morning, Alex Colvin. Dean Colvin is going to talk to some of our government partners, but I want to just take a moment to welcome everyone and say that we're very happy to have Dean Colvin here. He's a great supporter of Buffalo and the Buffalo CoLab. Dean Colvin, you'll hear from his speech, grew up in Saskatoon, Canada. He is an interesting person. He didn't just come to study the social sciences, labor and employment right away. At first, he went to the University of Toronto, where he received a Bachelor's of Science in Astronomy and Astrophysics. He then attended law school at the University of Toronto. And then after law school, he decided that his passion was labor and employment, and he went on to earn a master's degree in industrial relations. Dean Colvin then came to Cornell, where he received his PhD. And after a brief stint working somewhere else, he came back to Cornell as a professor. And then since 2019, Dean Colvin has been our dean. He's really universally beloved at the ILR school. He has done a really great job in hiring new faculty, in creating a new ILR curriculum for the 21st century. And he also, while he's doing all that administrative work, he maintains a very extensive body of research and writing. So thank you so much, Dean Colvin, for coming.
Great. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for the kind words. It's my pleasure on behalf of the school to welcome everybody to today's CoLab High Road Summit. I do want to start by thanking the people who put the work into creating this summit today. This year of Zoom, as always, I think we have to acknowledge and appreciate the tech workers who have been the backbone of being able to continue to work. So I want to thank them for their efforts for this summit. So this year marks the 75th anniversary of ILR's office in Buffalo. So a very significant anniversary for us. Going back in time, ILR had been founded in 1945 by an act of the state legislature as the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations. In our office, Dean's office, we have the original act of the legislature and the signature of Governor Dewey on that, creating our school. And it was founded with the mission of benefiting the people of the state by improving labor management relations through its research, through its teaching, and also through its extension work. We, from the very foundation of the school, had a mission of being out in the state, helping the people of the state. And we've had a commitment to continuing that. We began that mission with our very first extension office, opened in Buffalo in 1946. So Buffalo was really the starting point for fulfilling that mission that we were tasked with by the state. It's something that we continue to be committed to. We've fulfilled that mission today through our work, and we look forward to continuing to do so in the years to come. I do want to appreciate the support of our local, state, and local leaders who've been so critical to this. In particular, I want to thank Assembly members Monica Wallace, John Rivera, Patrick Burke, Karen McMahon, and Bill Conrad. And I also want to thank the state senators for their support, including Tim Kennedy, Sean Ryan, and Patrick Gallivan. This is important to us. Cornell is the New York State land grant institution. We fulfill that public role for New York State, and we're particularly proud that this outreach office brings the talents and resources of Cornell University right into Buffalo. And so we look forward to continuing that important role for Western New York. For today's session, creating an equitable economy and democratic community is a central task for our time, and good public policy is at the heart of that. There's a terrific lineup of speakers for today's summit, and I'm sure, like me, you're looking forward to hearing from them. And so without further ado, I want to turn back to Rusty and look forward to hearing from all the speakers today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Colvin. We appreciate, as always, your support and your kind words. We're going to start off today with a session called Building Institutions for Racial Equity and Social Justice. Our speakers are Leah Halton Pope, Senior Advisor to Assembly Majority Leader Crystal Peoples-Stokes, and Dr. Courtney McClooney, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Cornell ILR School. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you. So we're going to start things off. Ms. Halton Pope, if you don't mind, we're going to start with you. So the Assembly Majority Leader is well known for her efforts in advancing racial equity and social justice across the state, both from her time as an Erie County legislator and certainly today in her role in the Assembly. One of the policies that she's proposed recently is for an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice in the state of New York to be housed in the executive office, something that might be able to institutionalize practices to make the public sector more responsive to the needs of communities that have been left out of economic development practices for a long time. Would you be able to give us an overview of that policy and what it might take to make it happen?
Sure. So the leader is clear, and I think we all are, that we can create all kinds of legislation. And though you can create great policy, you can still, no matter what you do, you cannot legislate against racial bias or implicit bias. But we can do what we can to create opportunities for learning and hopes to make things better for our community as a whole. And so this piece of legislation, the bill number is A2358. It, as you said before, would create an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. And then it would establish, oversee, manage, and coordinate and facilitate the development of the state's racial equity and social justice action plan. It would facilitate racial equity and social justice training for all state employees. It advises and assists state agencies in developing policies, plans, and programs for improving racial equity and social justice. It would perform racial equity and social justice reviews and make recommendations for improving management and program effectiveness as it relates to racial equity and social justice, including like an annual racial equity and social justice impact statement, which would accompany the executive budget every year. It also would establish and oversee and manage a racial equity and social justice advisory committee. Obviously the whole purpose of it is that, you know, we take these actions to acknowledge and support equity and social justice, but there's no central location within state government. And quite frankly, all policies, procedures, actions that are taken by the state of New York, those are solely, it's responsible on us, well, I would say on you all as state leaders, so that deals with her colleagues, to create opportunities to train, so that at least in state government, we're doing a better job of making sure there's equity across the board and social justice. And this has been, as you mentioned, a passion of the majority leader prior to even becoming an elected official in any capacity. This has been a priority in making sure that there was equity and social justice in our community and within the state, and quite frankly, this country. And I guess to answer your question, what would it take to get it passed? The Assembly, it's about majority, it's about numbers and getting more people to support the legislation. You don't have to have 76 people on the bill, but you do need to have 76 people to move it knowing that they're going to agree that this is a piece of legislation, that it's worth moving to the floor and voting on it. So we're actively seeking more support to move it in both houses, both the Senate and in the Assembly. The Senate sponsor, Senator Kennedy, he and the Majority Leader have an excellent relationship. And so we're working pretty feverishly to get us done because it's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Just a quick follow-up question for you. So a lot of our audience members who have registered for this event are from community organizations, they're everyday residents. What can the average citizen do to help advance a bill like this? What power do we have to help the Majority Leader and Senator Kennedy push this initiative and get more of our representatives to support it?
I think advocacy in any way possible. Phone calls are helpful, letters are helpful, not to those who are already supporting the bill, although we like to hear that, but I think you want to reach out to those who don't seem to understand the importance of equity. I think a lot of people are still, which is strange, don't understand that there is a difference in equity and equality. And staffers and electeds alike sometimes need reminders. It's not always intentional, but where constituents can be helpful is just urging them to support, not from a combative state, but more of an educational place. This is why this is important to me. This is what's important to my community. And as your constituency, I need you to support this legislation, and here's why.
That's a great point, and something that I'd like to say about the bill for those who haven't read it or looked at it is, to your point, it's very thorough in terms of defining key terms. It distinguishes between equity, equality. It defines social justice as it means for New York, as it takes meaning for that bill and for New York State. Would you mind just giving our audience members a brief overview of those definitions and some of the key distinctions there and how they advance a vision for racial equity and social justice across the state?
It could take a second. Let me pull up all of the definitions so that I don't belabor this. If you give me 1 second. I'm sorry, it just looks like I lost my volume for a moment.
Not a problem.
Okay, so I guess so social justice means every individual deserves to benefit from the same economic, political, and social rights and opportunities, free from health disparities regardless of race, socioeconomic status, age, sex, including on the basis of gender identity or orientation, religion, disability, or other characteristics. Race means a social construct that artificially divides people into distinct groups based on characteristics such as physical appearance, including color, ancestral heritage, cultural affiliation, cultural history, ethnic classification, and the social, economic, and political needs of a society at a given period. Inequity means systemic and pattern differences in well-being that disadvantages one group in favor of another, caused by past and current decisions, systems of power and privilege, and policies. And then I don't know how many definitions, but I can keep going if you want. Institutional racism means policies, practices, and procedures that work better for some members of a community than others based on race. So racial equity and social justice means changes in policy, practice, and allocation of state resources so that race or social justice constructs do not predict an individual's success while also improving opportunities and outcomes for all people.
Great, thank you so much. And so for those of you who are interested in reading those definitions for yourself, Our colleague Kriki Kazak has linked the bill in the chat. But one of the, again, reasons for highlighting this is, rarely do we say what we mean when it comes to advocating for racial equity or social justice. And here we have what seems like a fully formed vision for institutionalizing policies and practices for advancing those concepts, specific operational definitions of those concepts in New York state governance. And so on that note, I want to shift scales a bit and go to Dr. McClooney, whose research focuses more on the workplace and looking to institutionalize similar practices to create inclusive workplaces. And so Dr. McClooney, thank you again for joining us. I'd like to just ask some questions that I know your research covers, which is, can you discuss how practices of marginalization become part of organizational norms, how members from marginalized groups navigate these norms, and how organizations and individuals might resist marginalization to create more inclusive workplaces going forward?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rusty. And thank you all again for having me for this summit. I'll quickly define what I mean by the term marginalization, why I think it's important for us as scholars to identify and name the systems and processes that are in place that create marginalized groups and disenfranchisement throughout our society. So for too often, I think we think of people of color, women, people who are differently abled, those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and more members of the sexual minority community as marginalized groups without ever interrogating what makes them marginalized or why and how is this group being marginalized in a particular sector, whether that's the workplace or in the political sphere or in society writ large. So what I tried to do in my research is to help companies identify some of the practices they have in place that are routinely leading to the underrepresentation and persistent inequality and inequity that is experienced and usually burdened by members of particular groups. So by marginalization, what it often boils down to are seemingly innocuous practices that have been part of our workplace norms for a long time and are just now being interrogated as potential contributors to the inequities that we are witnessing when we look at the lived experiences of members of marginalized groups in the workplace. One of the ones that my research has distilled down on, and I published a bit in the Harvard Business Review, is on this notion of professionalism and code switching. The term professionalism has many different meanings, but in mostly Western society, mostly white dominated society, professionalism almost always defaults to norms that are considered white professional norms, everything from how you appear to style of speech. And it also gets very specific to region or whether or not you were raised in a rural area versus urban area. All of these different classifications that we associate with professionalism will proportionally lead to discrimination against members of different groups. We're seeing this right now on a national scale when it comes to natural hairstyling that disproportionately affects Black women in the workplace. People have been fired or have had jobs rescinded because their hairstyles were considered unprofessional or unkempt. And these are coded words and languages that ultimately mean we want to normalize and default to a certain set of norms and appearances when it comes to what it means to be professional in the workplace. So that practice, that marginalization practice of professionalism, is leading members of marginalized groups to engage in different behaviors so that they can navigate this work environment. In order for me to be taken seriously as a professional or as an academic, in order for me to succeed in this job interview, I might engage in a form of code switching. And code switching has lots of different meanings. It has a certain meaning within linguistic studies, but the way that my colleagues and I approach this concept is trying to understand the behavioral adjustments and changes that members of marginalized groups enact in order to make someone else in this interaction feel comfortable with them and not discriminate against them. So one way that code switching can manifest in the workplace is through people changing their hairstyle, straightening their hair for a job interview so that it appears more Eurocentric and more common to the dominant group norms. And that way it lowers the possibility of them being discriminated against or having certain attributes attributed to them. I think it was on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver that recently covered some of this work on natural hair bias, where Black women with Afrocentric hairstyles are perceived as less competent and less professional at work, and therefore are less likely to be hired or promoted. So some of the ways that marginalized members try to navigate this is through code switching, changing their hair, changing how they speak, even changing clothes they wear or behavioral mannerisms that are associated with their culture and may be considered unprofessional in white dominant spaces. And even in this new remote work environment, my colleagues and I have collected data showing that a lot of people of color really like the virtual distance between themselves and their colleagues, that they're not having to code switch as much. But then there are other factors that come into play when your home and work life become blurred, and it becomes a bit more difficult to keep those two things separate. People were sharing how they hear their spouse's work voice for the first time ever, and realizing that people have completely different personas when they go into the workplace. And although everyone code switches to some extent, the stakes and the risk are much higher for members of marginalized groups. It is quite costly, and it can affect your physical health to change your hairstyle at a frequent rate. And Black women have been exposed to some harsh chemicals in order to straighten their hair, in order to not have some of the inequities that Leah pointed out in her examples of institutional racism. So some of the ways that I think organizations and members of marginalized groups can start to resist these practices by naming them, by acknowledging that this grooming policy that you have at work is disproportionately affecting members of our population. And if we actually strive to be an inclusive workplace, to have a space where people can not only survive, but thrive in these environments, we need to start to question all of our seemingly normal practices and start to ask different types of questions. Instead of wondering and wanting to count how many members of underrepresented groups are present in this workplace or on this board, I encourage companies to start asking what sort of policies have we put in place that continue to reproduce an overrepresentation of white men on our boards? Why do we seem to attract that group of people and promote them at rates much faster than other groups, although they are not numerically more overrepresented in the population? What sort of stipulations have we put into our resume guidelines that leads us to have very few people from marginalized groups on our candidate slates when it comes time for hiring? And of course, as we move into this more AI-centric world, we're noticing that algorithms are just as biased as humans are. So it's going to be really difficult for us to avoid all the ways that human bias emerges in these workplace processes and norms. So that's my sort of broad approach to approaching the study of marginalization in the workplace. And I think that policies like what's happening at the federal level and what Crystal Stokes is trying to promote here in New York State are certainly necessary in order to normalize this accountability and acknowledgement of the various ways that institutional racism and bias emerges in our different sectors, in the workplace in particular.
Thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to touch on one point that you mentioned. This idea of companies doing sort of analyses to quantify the number of people that fit different categories and say that that's how they're enacting change, or that's how they're keeping themselves accountable. That tends to exist, of course, in governments as well, where a lot of the policies that we write are about counting people and categorizing them rather than looking at real actual quality of life and getting that community-driven qualitative input that you need to create different outcomes. And so that's where I see an interesting connection between, even though these two things are happening at different scales, how could some of the research that you've done that look at those sort of more local knowledge, that lived experience information that we need, how can that filter up and go into something like an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice that would be responsible for action planning and creating some sort of a strategic racial equity plan for an entire state? What sorts of processes or methods, mechanisms, outreach can be done in order to get those worlds to align a little bit better?
Yes, I think we're seeing this right now with worker movements. We are seeing this collective resistance of the ongoing forms of marginalization that have happened in workplaces for a long time. This refusal to work for less than minimum wage, this refusal to work in organizations that are hazardous to our well-being, this collective action that's happening across our country and really across the world is starting to put pressure on policymakers to force organizations and corporations to really think about what will it take to address some of the unemployment and gaps in employment issues that we are seeing in our country. COVID-19 really created an opportunity for us to start to question what type of working conditions have we allowed to persist for a long time. Things like going to work when you are sick, because we have not created the type of policies that will protect workers from having to use what limited time off they have for all sorts of ailments that are part of the human experience. So I think that these collective mobile actions is also starting to ratchet up into the political sphere. Indeed, the Crown Act, the Creating Respectful and Open Work Environments for Natural Hair Act, started from legislators who have all experienced some form of discrimination in their work environments when it came to their natural hair, different sort of reactions and bias. And together they helped to create this bill that is now being passed in several states. So that is one of the channels or mechanisms through which we can take these individualized experiences of discrimination at the workplace level and scale it up to something that is now hopefully going to be adopted at the federal level. Will we make it discriminatory, or we can now create a law that protects people from that type of discrimination happening in the workplace. I also think that your point was a valid one, that the type of metrics that we are collecting, the ways that we're holding people accountable, cannot just rely on numeric numbers, but also the qualitative experiences of people. And a lot of my work also captures qualitative data. There's one study I have going on right now in Detroit, Michigan, looking at their entrepreneurial ecosystem, where you would imagine in a city like Detroit that is majority Black, that most of their entrepreneurs who are part of these venture capital firms or members of certain incubators and accelerators would also reflect the population. But what they're finding is that it does not. And one of the main reasons why is the qualitative differences they have when it comes to evaluating a viable venture. They're still normalizing a white male-centric model that is now leading to a disproportionate number of people from their own population being represented in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So what I've been trying to look for in terms of seeing a change in organizations is not just how many more people of color are coming to your workplace, but how are you all changing your language around racial injustice and equity? Are we still seeing people with trepidation? Are we still seeing white fragility emerge? Or is the type of communications that's happening internal to the company also shifting, demonstrating that they have this deeper understanding of what equity means compared to equality, as Leah mentioned earlier? Or do they have a better understanding of how we might hold each other accountable for injustice? So looking at those qualitative changes is also another way that we can better document progression towards racial justice in the workplaces and hopefully at the national and state level as well.
Thank you so much. It seems that we may have lost Ms. Helton Pope here for a moment. She fell off. So I do have a question that I wanted to go to both of you, but Dr. McLooney, if you wouldn't mind, I'll keep putting you on the spot since it's just you and I right now. But on that, basically along the same lines of these metrics and sort of doing things differently, I've noticed that a lot of legislation, a lot of initiatives that we go to, it's not even just about quantification, it's about making numbers align. We focus on gaps, and the goal is always closing those gaps, not necessarily thinking about what ceilings we're at or what floors we're at and raising the bar, raising the ceiling for all people, and thinking about strategies to use John A. Powell's words of targeted universalism, trying to find ways that we begin pushing forward to make work, to make a community, to make life better for everyone. So if you wouldn't mind just reacting to that a bit. So what are the ways that we should be attacking some of these problems? Is it to focus on gaps first, or is it to create new visions of what we need to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a third option that I'm not thinking of?
Well, two things come to mind for me, Rusty. On the one hand, I'm thinking about when you center the experiences of individuals who are marginalized, you tend to address the issues that all people are facing. In a society that has attempted to erase the existence of Indigenous people, that has continued to dehumanize Black and Latinx people, that has continued to use and exploit Asian American and Asian people's labor, but then turn around and think of them as disease carriers and then enacting violence. I think when we address all of the various ways that we've embedded those elements into our society, we will address all the issues that are affecting people, like poverty. Poverty has no color. There's a lot of people who are from the majority race who are also living in conditions of poverty. But thinking about those who are the most marginalized and oppressed among us, we tend to, as you said, lift all boats if we can address the more structural and foundational inequalities that are embedded in our society. I'm also thinking about a project that I completed almost 10 years ago now, looking at perceptions of stress in the workplace compared to a more objective measure of stress that was completed by the Department of Labor. So in this longitudinal data set, my colleagues and I compared Black and white workers, all of who were over age 50, and their perceptions of working in environments that the Department of Labor had labeled as stressful or not, based on various dimensions like autonomy, the extent to which you have physical support for your work, your manager support, et cetera. And what we found is that both Black and white workers perceive their jobs as stressful. That is a given, that a lot of our working conditions have contributed to stress, adding burnout to the World Health Organization as a hazard of the US work environment, right, is an element of that. But what we notice in addition, like this gap, as you mentioned, is that Black workers were experiencing similarly stressful jobs at a much higher level of stress. So there was even more issues affecting that group, and it had some long-term health consequences for them. These consequences also affected the white workers, just at a later stage. So as you mentioned, the gap is present, but eventually all of us will experience the hardships of inequality in our society and inequity. Some groups will just experience it at a much faster rate and at much more frequent rates than others. But addressing those root problems is ultimately going to help to reduce all the harms that will come out after the fact, including for members of more dominant groups. I hope that starts to answer your question. I know I was a bit wildy there with my answer.
Yeah, yes, definitely. And so I guess in sort of a more anything's on the table sort of a question.
Okay.
Let's not say about your workplace because Cornell is hosting us. We don't want to say anything about Cornell. But for those folks who are out there watching, if you were in a different sort of a work environment, what are the top 2 things that you would try to change right away to be able to overcome some of these challenges that you've been discussing with marginalization and the habits that a lot of us don't even perceive that are just ongoing? So what are ways to expose those habits and those practices and to begin to change them immediately?
Yeah, so I'll think back to my previous jobs. So my very first job was at McDonald's. And I think what is happening right now with the workers advocating for a $15 an hour wage was something that, as a high school student, I was happy to receive any amount of money. But that is something that I would certainly encourage more workers joining and hopefully having the power to unionize with each other so that they can better advocate for fair wages. And I've also worked in nonprofit space. And one of the things I noticed in those areas, there has been a recent call for us to shift from a charitable model to justice model when it comes to philanthropic organizations and nonprofits, because in that sphere and sector as well, this desire to want to do good and help address social inequality is keeping inequality intact. A lot of nonprofits wouldn't exist if social inequalities didn't exist. So is the actual goal to rid the world of inequities, or is it to keep it going to some extent so that you have a cause to donate to? And I think those are all going to be really important changes and shifts that need to happen in those spheres specifically. So I'll end my comments there and not go into academia quite yet.
No, excellent points. It looks like we have Ms. Helton Pope back, who is experiencing some connectivity issues. So welcome back. If you don't mind, I'd like to put you on the spot now that we have you back. And I'd like to ask, there was a question in the Q&A about how citizens can find out if their representatives supports the majority leaders initiatives, especially around this Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. I know that by going and visiting the bill, you can see individuals who have already co-sponsored it. Is there a way for us to find out, or is there any sort of an infrastructure available to know if our legislators even do the sponsors of these bills do in order to see if they can gain support for them in that?
So the probably the best way would be to just call their offices and ask if they support the legislation. The website I gave, the nyassembly.gov, will just tell you who's on the bill. But I think just asking for the legislative director in any of those legislators' offices would be very helpful. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
I turned off my camera, so hopefully that would make it better. But that's probably the most accurate way to determine whether or not their representative supports the legislation, just give them a call, talk to the LD, ask them there.
Thank you. And so to follow up on that, I had mentioned at the outset that one of the tasks that our units in Buffalo tries to do is democratize information that can help advance some of these issues that advance an equitable economy and democratic society. And so a call to action to all of you that are out there, call your representatives and find out whether or not they support it and send us the information, and we can map it out and make it accessible in one location so that any user could come in and see whether or not their representatives are supporting this type of an initiative. And that way you have information to hold them accountable or to continue to call and continue to, as Ms. Halton Pope was saying, getting on the phone and advocating for this type of an action that we may want to see happen. So on that note, we have about 10 minutes left. We don't have any questions that I see in the Q&A right now, but I'll just put it out there for those of you who are in attendance. If you have questions, please go ahead and drop them in, and we can pose them to our speakers here. In the meantime, I'd like to discuss, if we are going to institutionalize some sort of statewide practice of ensuring that our public policies and public expenditures are being spent in an equitable way that's promoting social justice. What are the types of mechanisms that we would need for that? So having the office in and of itself gives us some sort of a centralized location where we can engage in planning, where we can set targets and set goals, hopefully through inclusive processes like Dr. McClooney is saying, so that we have that lived experience informing those plans and procedures. But then from there, what sort of mechanism would we need? If we do have an office, what powers would it have to go out and look at, say, a city and a city's public expenditures and determine whether or not they're being spent in a way that's promoting racial equity and social justice? So that's a very broad question, and I'd pose it to both of you to see if you have any sort of thoughts on that. But it seems that we would need some infrastructure behind that. The office is something that we need right away, perhaps, but what would have to come in conjunction with that to be able to enforce a statewide plan for racial equity and social justice?
Some of the entrepreneurs that I had talked with in Detroit had a lot of great ideas on how their city government might help to incentivize essentially this support for minority-owned businesses. So Detroit and lots of other cities are going through lots of renovations and changes, and that could lead to gentrification if there's not some sort of checks and balances in place on how many mixed use or mixed income neighborhoods can we create, et cetera. So trying to incentivize the city for having more minority-owned construction companies, for instance. And I think what can happen at this state level as well is, are there certain tax codes that can be adjusted for businesses that are intentionally engaging with minority suppliers or soliciting farmers in New York State? I know one of my students in their presentation talked about the disproportionate number of Black farmers in the state. So are there going to be incentives that helps increase that, to increase their profit sharing and their supply with other companies? Will there be any sort of initiatives towards that? I think that's one way and mechanism that there can be this sort of accountability or ways to implement and encourage people follow a statewide racial equity initiative.
Well, I will say we do have.
We may have dropped our connection again with Ms. Leah Halton Pope.
I do see two questions in the chat, or like one in the chat and one in the Q&A.
Yes. So while we wait to see if we can reestablish this connection, I believe, Dr. McClooney, that both of these questions are going to be directed to you. Number one is, if you are in a workplace that's trying to change, how do you work with those who are resistant to it? What are some of the best practices that we could follow?
Yeah, and now my video is being weird. Okay, there we go, it's better. I think about the term tempered radical when I see this notion here, where there's some people who are very much open to change and wanting to work with it. Others have lots of valid reasons as to why they're not as willing to publicly advocate for change. So I think where I would recommend people move forward is to think about coalition building, that there are some issues that you might be able to address with certain initiatives, policies, protests, and there's going to be others that aren't on the table. But how can you find as much common ground as possible so that people who are resistant to some form of change, what are the other changes that they might be more interested in? And how can you make that part of your collective sense of change?
So a lot of it is about dialogue and communication then.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question that we still have unanswered is, and this goes back, I believe, to one of your comments, Dr. McClooney, about AI.
Mm-hmm.
How does artificial intelligence affect hiring practices, and why isn't it neutral?
Yes, and I saw that someone put in the Q&A, the documentary Coded Bias. Highly recommend that people check out that documentary. It's fantastic. And one of the short answer is artificial intelligence designed by humans who are still biased. So our thinking goes into the algorithm. And so it's really hard for us to have anything that's neutral in a society where humans are dictating the focus. And I think one way to think about this is an algorithm is essentially outputting information based off what you have inputted. So when we think about the inputs versus outputs, there's going to be bias potentially on either end of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now we are down to about 5 minutes here. We, I believe, went through all of the questions in the Q&A. So I just like to ask, now I think we do have Ms. Halton Pope back here, so it looks great. If each of you, and we'll start with you, Leah, if you don't mind me calling you Leah, since we have you back. Just in terms of, number one, next steps. So I know we talked about what people can do to call their representatives and express support for these types of initiatives that we're talking about. But beyond just one office or one piece of legislation, what are other next steps that can get folks more involved and participatory in our governance processes to advocate for these types of issues? And then where can we find more about the majority leader on the internet, current initiatives, all of that? Feel free to plug anything that she has going on. And then similar questions to you, Dr. McClooney. What are the next steps for moving forward and making more equitable workplaces? And where can we find you on social media and find out more about your work?
So I think I'll start. The easiest next step for people to find out more information, to move legislation forward, is to coalesce around an issue, any particular issue, right? So I think communicating to your legislators, they've been elected solely to represent you and the needs of your community. And by expressing what I need, how we need it to be done, and then understanding what the process is. So the next steps would be, these are the issues that we see, like this legislation, most legislation, there's some unintended consequence of it. Acknowledging that that's it, not everything is going to be perfect, figuring out a way if there's more legislation that needs to happen, but it's not enough just to pass the bill. The next step for me, even after it passes, would be educating communities. And this is how it works, and this is how it applies to you, and putting it in action and making people accountable. It's not enough to have a new office if it's staffed with the same individuals who don't quite understand what this means. And so it's any legislation that we've passed, and the leader has just recently passed the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and that came from solely a social equity lens and looking at how to get people there. But it's not enough to just pass a bill. Now we're looking at the implementation. Who's going to be in that office? Who's representing? What is their track record? And being intentional about who you bring in. So there's also some other legislation that deals with training civil service workers, so that when those individuals get into those offices, because they're civil service jobs, they're also trained and understand how to deal with those issues. To find more information about the majority leader and what she's doing, she, unlike 90% of her colleagues, she actually has to be on the floor. We go to Albany every week. So you can see her on the nyassembly.gov page live every single session day. You can also follow her on her Assembly website, on Twitter at C People Stokes, on Facebook and Instagram, Miss Crystal People Stokes, and we're everywhere. So and of course you can call the office either in Buffalo at 716-897-9714 or in Albany 518-455-5005, or you can find me.
Thank you so much. Dr. McClooney, same questions, please.
Yeah, and I'll echo everything that Leah just said, that we need to make sure that we're holding people accountable. It's not enough to have a statement. And one of the things that happened this past year was lots of companies made public statements that they care about racial justice, that they are trying to support Black lives. And so now we have a public statement, a public documentation to hold them accountable to those statements. And then we are seeing their employees holding them accountable, calling out where they are not aligning these statements with actions. We saw this in Alabama with Amazon workers attempting to unionize, and now there's more legal investigations into that process because there seem to be some violations of their rights to unionize as an organization. And so what I've encouraged my colleagues to do, and all of us who are studying diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, is looking at these statements and following these companies very closely. To what extent are they going to honor this statement that they value Black lives? What does it mean to value Black lives inside of your company and outside of your company? What sort of changes are you going to put in place that aren't just numeric, but also qualitatively different approaches to your workplace? So holding them accountable, I certainly think is the main goal, and also helping them along the way, helping provide the guardrails. One of the things that I've seen that hasn't worked well is companies try to take on all of racial justice issues and solve racism tomorrow. And then for anyone who's confused, you cannot solve racism tomorrow, not by having a guest speaker, not by doing one-off things. There has to be sustained commitment to this work, and figuring out ways to help guide and identify, what is a realistic fix for today and what is more a long-term commitment for another day. And are we planting the seeds for future generations to create more equitable societies? So you can find me at my website, CourtneyLMcClooney.com. And also I'm very active on Twitter at CL_McClooney. I also have a LinkedIn profile. That's just my name. I'm on Clubhouse. And sometimes I'm engaging with audiences there, but it has been a pleasure to be part of this summit. And I'm so excited to see the future of ILR Buffalo CoLab.
Thank you for that. And thank you both so much for your time, sharing your expertise, and giving us some concrete steps to move forward and to start enacting more equitable practices and inclusive practices at work, and being more active in government and participating in the political process to let our elected officials know what values we're after and what changes we'd like to see. So I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you so much. For those of you still on, we do have a second session coming up in about 15 minutes called Fighting Low Road Economic Development that will feature Assemblymember Ron Kim and Executive Director of Athena, Danya Rahendra. Please do attend that. If you're able to, there's a link to that session in the chat. And if you're registered for it, you should have already received an invitation to join us for that in 15 minutes. Again, thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to Dean Colvin for the introduction, all of our elected officials who are in attendance. It's wonderful to have you all here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you.